a special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, what archaeology can teach us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions that archaeology in the Middle East make to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, and I'm joined by two colleagues, Dr. Larry Garrity, former president at the university, now continuing to work to support the archaeology program, a growing and strong archaeology program. We thank you, Larry. And Dr. Kent Bramlett, who is Associate Professor of Archaeology and the History of Antiquity, also at La Sierra. We are in our third of three episodes on the book of Joshua. A book that I've heard you say you're not particularly drawn to devotionally, but a book that carries some of these stories. I mean, what kinds of stories do we turn to the book of Joshua for?
Well, one has to wonder how Israel got to the Promised Land. And we know they were in Egypt, and the rest of the Bible is about, the Old Testament part, is about Israel and the nation that it becomes. But how did it get there? Joshua is that key. And some of the complexities of Joshua can perplex us or can intrigue us, but hopefully can lead us to a better understanding of how that came to be.
Do you think that that happens sometimes with these stories of origin? I mean, in some sense, they're an etiology. They're explaining why we are who we are, or how we got here, where we came from. Is that a kind of a, I mean, everybody has their origin stories, and maybe that's part of our challenge, is that these are so important, and we have to pay attention to them, and we learn from both the biblical record and the archaeological one, but there's a lot that hangs on them.
Right, it's the Mayflower, the Plymouth Rock, Thanksgiving of Israel.
It is. And Joshua gives us that. And Jericho, fighting the Battle of Jericho, and some of the other stories of what we call the conquest that I think most scholars have put into marks of parentheses, or marks of quotation, because there is a lot of suggestion that this was a little bit more gradual. Didn't go quite it wasn't quite the blitzkrieg that you kind of sense. And maybe the blitzkrieg comes from the fact that the conquest of Canaan happens in 4 chapters. Once Jericho and Ai are cared for, it's chapters 9 through 12, and bang, it's all over. So you get that feel of this lightning military blitzkrieg.
But we should never forget that right there in the Bible, when you read Judges, there's the rest of the story, you know, as they used to say on the radio.
And I think, actually, Larry, that reminder should be helpful to us as we try to sort out not only the places where facts seem to match the scriptural story, but where there seems to be a challenge. What I've called the potential good news, or potentially good news. And perhaps that should be helpful, that the biblical writers themselves share varied perspectives on this very important origin story. I mean,
that's one of the things that people have pointed to as a reason for inspiration. I mean, they're willing to put contradictory evidence together and let the reader sort it out. You know, they don't necessarily do it themselves and try to make everything mesh and perfectly right, but they put all of the material there, and it gives you an impression of what happened, but every detail may be not understood.
Or understood differently by different people. I mean, especially the Old Testament, when you have books like Proverbs, so traditional, a terrific book about how to live, how to make sense of life, and then Ecclesiastes, this more philosophical approach, and Ecclesiastes is kind of arguing with Proverbs. The book of Job argues with Deuteronomy, the theology of Deuteronomy. You have a
Job argues with God.
And Job argues with God. And you have a Genesis 1 and a Genesis 2 that are looking at the creation account in different sorts of ways. So I think that's a great suggestion. Should remind us.
Right, and even in Joshua, it says they didn't occupy the whole land, and certain tribes didn't fully possess their land, like the Danites had to go up north because they weren't able to secure their allotment. So it's clear that there's a lot of complexity and that it's over a period of time.
Right, right. And when we turn to the book of Judges for our next episode on this program, we will see much more of the kind of match that we typically think about. Here's Bible, here's the story, here's what we know biblically, here's archaeology, and they mesh quite well. Not as easily with the book of Joshua. We have some artifacts. Larry and Kent, tell us about what is here. We've seen these before, but I think it's important as we start each episode to say something about what is in front of us.
Go ahead, Kent.
Well, one table full of weaponry and half another table with weaponry. So I guess that's the theme. We have various kinds of bronzes here, swords and spears, so the short, close-range fighting tools, as well as javelins, battle axes, a variety of types of arrowheads here. We have the three-bladed, very small arrowheads. We have flat arrowheads, and basically it represents the full range of close-hand fighting that was what Joshua and his men.
Yeah, we can hardly talk about the book of Joshua without talking about weapons. I have heard that people have calculated how many people died in Joshua. And then when you add that up with how many people died in Judges, and you've got a city. I mean, you've got a reasonably good-sized city.
And don't we have the stories in the book of Judges about how many of these things that were owned by the Israelites had to really come from the Philistines because they're the only ones who had the technology to sharpen and to make these things. So they were very precious, weren't they, to the Israelites?
Bronze. I mean, think of the tin has to come from
Turkey, maybe.
Some maybe from Turkey, some further from Afghanistan.
Right.
And then copper is valuable, maybe Cyprus, but it's not an everyday material. So they had to resort to other more ordinary weapons.
Maybe the more ordinary ones are over on my table with what we would think about as sling stones, call them ballista. But they're the kind of stone that housewives would pick up readily and use in the kitchen for pounding, maybe with herbs, something like that. But these are mace heads, wooden handle put in them, and although some were used ceremonially, these were often used in battle. Again, close.
It's alabaster, isn't it, too?
Yeah.
At least a couple of them
it is calcited alabaster.
And these would leave what? An impression.
Well, yes, they
to say the least.
And we can see that, right?
Right. Skulls have the fracture marks of battle axes. And
then pottery from this period of different kinds. Kent, your very favorite piece in that nicely shaped
yes, this perfect wheel thrown form that it continues. This is a little earlier. It continues into our period, but it loses some of that perfect proportionality.
Right. In this episode, we want to turn to a couple of things actually that I think will help complete the picture of Joshua, and then we want to come to the end of the book where maybe the purpose of the book is really made most clear, and that's pulling Israel together with God in a covenant relationship. And maybe if we would allow that theme to shape our reading of and understanding of the book, that might take some of the edge off of this this need to make everything fit, all of the facts and all of the history and so on. So we'll see as we take a look at that. One of the things, the outline we've seen before, a fairly crisp outline. We've talked before about Jericho and Ai. We've talked about the conquest of central, south, and north part taking place in the first half of the book. But now we turn to the divisions of the land, this idea of a land grant document. This is who gets what.
And it specifies pretty closely the edges and the villages and towns that are there and so forth. Yeah.
And then these concluding speeches, which again, sometimes we look at the first part of a book define its purpose, but maybe we should look at the end of it, when it's really an attempt to call God's people to courage, especially in the face of disaster, and to covenant, to courage and to covenant. I mean, that is the purpose. And if we lose sight of that purpose in our debates about who did what and what happened and what didn't happen and what evidence supports what, maybe we've missed the point of the book.
It's true.
We should maybe pay attention to that. Well, one of the important discoveries that, boy, when was this made? I don't know when the discovery was made. Was it Napoleonic? Okay.
Or Petrie's time, I think.
Okay.
I think you're right.
So end of the 19th century, toward the end of the 19th century. Kent, what is this? You love Egypt and Egyptian history. We're in Egypt. We're actually in the Cairo Museum to get these photos.
You can go in and see it. You can, well, touch it, actually.
That's right.
It's not behind glass.
Right.
The Merneptah stela. A carved slab of rock could be with an inscription. This one has a very lengthy inscription talking about the achievements of the pharaoh known as Merneptah. So he's one of the last ones in the 18th dynasty, right before the start of the 19th dynasty. And what is particularly fascinating for us is that near the bottom, is it up 6 lines or so?
It's somewhere down in here.
5,
it's not.
Yeah.
Actually, on the real one, they've actually circled it with some chalk or
yeah.
paint
You can have people.
But it's down here somewhere.
Polished. It mentions Israel. This is interesting. He's actually talking about his campaign up into Canaan, and he mentions the cities that he's conquered: Gezer, Yanoam, and they are indicated with the Egyptian hieroglyphic that's called a determinative that indicates the name is a city, a people resident in a city.
Because some would be some would be state or city.
There's determinative
but this one
for
is
all
not.
sorts of classes.
Right. So
now
that's
Gezer and Yanoam. When it comes to Israel, it doesn't use the city determinative.
Right.
It uses the people.
Right.
So these are largely unsettled people. It's our first reference from a contemporary document or inscription that refers to Israel.
And the only reference in Egyptian sources, right?
That's right. There's a potential partial one that they've tried to reconstruct.
More recently.
Yeah,
right.
but it's really the
And this one dates to?
Well, it depends on the astronomical point of observation, but 1207, 1209, 1213, right within about 10 years there.
So not too far from for people who are thinking about this, the later date for the Exodus in the 13th century, a bit farther removed, but I don't think it's any less helpful if one is thinking about the earlier 15th century date for the Exodus.
It shows that by this time, around 1200 BC, certainly Israelites were there in Canaan.
Right. In whatever, configuration,
right,
whatever shape,
right,
whatever. Now, the Pharaoh, the good news here is that it's nice to see Israel in print in this very early reference.
And if you think that the references to these towns and peoples that Kent mentioned that are in the inscription, if they're in geographical order, they come to Israel in Galilee. So that's where they run into the Israelites, or at least in the northern part of the country.
Yes, and there is this tremendously affirming sense when you see this name here. The negative side here is that they were whipped.
Yes, right. Yeah,
so, in some cases, it seems to me, maybe most, where an Israelite name, or even the name David, House of David, shows up in these inscriptions, but it's written by people
by the enemies.
By the other side,
right. But that gives it a credibility, doesn't it?
That's right. This is not Israel crowing, for itself. This is is the enemy talking about. In fact, some have argued that in it's not in Medinet Habu. What temple is it in? That some have argued that there are actually depictions of the Israelites.
Luxor.
It's in the Luxor temple, isn't it? And again, it's interesting. I mean, there's nothing that just says these are Israelites, but most people, or at least a lot of people, would say that this is a good idea. Again, the problem, though, is that they are underneath horses trampling them. So it's good to be there, but,
Well, and it's interesting that Israel, up until about this time, Egypt had been extremely dominant over Canaan. It was their colony, essentially. They had garrisons throughout it. Right. We don't hear anything of Israel, well, in Egypt in this area in Joshua. And this is really the last document that we have connecting the two. Mm-hmm. So it leads some question about why is it completely silent about the Egyptian presence in Canaan. So maybe most of the stories come from that point when Egypt is withdrawing, and they're no longer an issue.
Yeah.
We also know that the Egyptians preferred to be on the lower land and on the main roads and so on. Mm-hmm. They hesitated to go up into the hill country, which was so foreign to them, growing up in the sand of Egypt. They were scared, you know, to wander off. And that's the place where the Israelites apparently were, in the central hill country. Mm-hmm. So they didn't automatically run into the Egyptians down in the valleys. Mm-hmm.
Well, and if you add to that the theological layer, mm-hmm. that you don't go into the hill country because that really is under another deity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the other deities do better mm-hmm. in the hill country. Mm-hmm. And when battles occur, you don't want to meet your enemy on
their territory.
Person's territory, on their God's territory. So that's a layer that we typically don't put in here, but certainly the ancients would have. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, a couple other slides here that are interesting, that's intentionally out of focus because it wants to draw attention to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim with Shechem, or what's the modern Shechem?
Nablus in Palestine.
Nablus in Palestine, that's exactly right. So, Kent, what is the significance of these two sites in Joshua? Because we have some, some of these sites show up elsewhere, but in Joshua, what significance do we have?
Well, backtracking just to their location, this controls the route through the central highlands. So the road comes up through those green valleys and then angles west between the two peaks. So it's very strategic in its place. But this is where the blessings and the curses were enacted or read out at Joshua's farewell, or when they're taking after the peace, I guess we could say. And there was the large altar of sacrifice that they constructed on Mount Gerizim. The blessings were called forth from Mount Gerizim. And it's the covenant, or the renewal of the covenant.
And these mountains, the slopes are probably, close to a mile apart from each other?
Yeah, quite close. You could shout across.
So this is what's happening, is the antiphonal shouting back and forth of the blessings and the cursings, tied to this covenant formula in which God has taken over a political treaty and is illustrating his own relationship with Israel. And the blessings and cursings are part of that. The stipulations are clear, the Ten Commandments, but the blessings and the cursings are uttered to remind people this is
and
these are the outcomes.
we now know that so much better than we did when we just had the Bible, don't we? The Hittite Empire, which was very dimly understood until archaeologists came along and excavated all that, but they had these treaties that they made with the peoples that they conquered. And the Hittite overlord or a suzerain would say to them, if you're going to agree with this, we'll be your protector, and these are the stipulations of our relationship after what we've accomplished for you, and this is what we expect, and if you obey, these will be the blessings that you'll receive. If you disobey, then there'll be curses. And so many people see the Ten Commandments as the kind of stipulations in God's treaty with his people. And the whole book of Joshua can be better understood if you see it in the light of that treaty.
Correct. And as we talked when we were discussing the book of Deuteronomy, in some ways the whole book is outlined this way, and certainly the Ten Commandments. And so when we get to the end of the book of Joshua, we're going to come back to Shechem, because that matters. It's in this valley. Now, a couple of finds, not at Ebal or at Gerizim, but nearby, at a site called what?
Well, it's called the bowl site.
Because of this bowl,
right.
And you know, the fact that everybody's so excited about that shows that with all the excavations that have taken place up there in the hill country, it's very rare to find any pagan deity, if you want to call it that way, or idol. And so this is an unusual find.
And it was on the hilltop. Think of the high places. It would have been an open-air sanctuary, denuded now, but there were trees probably then. And this, maybe there's some small wall lines around, but it was the representation of the deity.
Now, do most scholars feel that this was should be dated to a time when Israelites were in control of the bull site? In fact, we can go to the next slide, which indicates the topography of the site. But would most people attribute this to Israelite settlement?
Yeah.
So making this adjustment to something closer to Yahweh, taking a symbol that was fairly popular. You used the word pagan.
But no, in Ugarit, El, the high god of the pantheon, his companion animal or representative animal was the bull. We called him Bull El. And so it seems that Israelites at this time period may have associated the bull actually with Elohim.
Yes,
God.
right.
We think of it in terms of Baal.
And we know that from what happened in the Exodus, where Aaron, it seems like, brought in the bull figure, the golden calf, which was an alternative to the Shekinah imagery that was in the Mosaic tabernacle. And so there seemed to be two traditions, and this was resurrected by Jeroboam when he established Dan and Bethel as the two sites that he wanted Israelites to come to so they wouldn't go to Jerusalem. And then he used the golden calf in those places too.
Let's think about now these tribal allotments. And we want to go through these fairly quickly. There are some trans-Jordan, so east of the Jordan River, and the tribes of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh. So here's a list. We'll look at some of them, but again, let's go quickly through them. We want to get back to Shechem, because Shechem is the way the book ends, and it should be the way we conclude our series on Joshua. So of these, I wished I could have gotten a picture of Aroer, which sits on the edge of Jordan's Grand Canyon. It's spectacular. We'll have occasion to come back to that one when we get to Judges, though. Here is a nice map indicating a number of these things, and here we are on the eastern side. Aroer is way down here, what is called the Arnon, or the Wadi Mujib. Heshbon is here. But we're talking about sites in these tribal allocations. And some of them we'll look at quickly. Heshbon, Larry and I, we've talked about that a lot before, but it's certainly an important part. Sometimes identified as Gadite and sometimes as Reubenite. It's kind of on the border, so maybe this suggests something about when the material was written.
And during the time of Jeremiah and Isaiah, sometimes they thought of it as Moabite, sometimes they thought of it as Ammonite.
That's true. The borders seem to shift. Okay, where's this from?
This is from the Madaba map, which is not very far from Heshbon, where we've been excavating.
And we won't take time to talk about it. It's a fantastic map, but it comes from Madaba, another town mentioned.
So that would be during the Byzantine period that the map was. But the interesting thing about that relates to what we're talking about is that on that map are 12 stones where the Israelites brought across from the Jordan River and erected there, and so those are depicted on that map.
So Tel Deban, we will talk more about this one later too.
One of the Moabite capitals. One of
the older, more classic pictures of the site. It's currently being excavated. And so now if we turn to Israel and we think about these three tribes, because they're the ones treated first, have a number of sites here. We'll only look at some. Again, we're talking about Judah, Manasseh, and Ephraim, so we're only looking at some of them. The site of Beersheba or Beersheba. We could talk about this a lot, but we won't take the time now. Lachish we've looked at before, an important southwestern site.
Marishah.
If one goes to Israel to see life in Old Testament times, you have to go to Marishah. Would you agree?
I would agree.
There's such a great illustration of things. Larry, I think you did something here. Maybe not fly the plane. But,
first place that I got my experience archaeologically. And this site of Gezer was given by the Egyptians to Solomon when he married his daughter.
So we have lots of history there. And the site of Dor over on the coast.
On the coast.
Megiddo. Can't think about Israel without thinking about Megiddo. And then another set, these allotments, different places and different tribes, different tribal groups. So let's just look at a couple of them. Again, in the map, we have several other tribal groups besides the ones we just talked about. So, Philistine, Ekron, or Ekron, as it is called. With an inscription on site identifying it as such. That's what we all wish we could find.
The last season.
Yeah, it's terrific. Hatzor, we've talked about before in the north. And this is Bet Shemesh, House of the Sun. Important, especially in the Samson story. We'll get to that. In any case, lots of these settlements around. And then we want to have this as the last one, the town of Shechem, and there are a number of features here, including this standing stone and a temple, the Baal Berit, right? The Baal of the Covenant temple. So the book of Joshua ends here. Ends with a covenant, like we were talking about a bit ago. What's it like to visit this place? Larry, you've been here several times.
You know, it's important for the history of archaeology because of the many teams that have worked here. The Germans were the first ones, and then along came the Americans. My professor, G. Ernest Wright, was the head of this in the 50s and 60s, and Siegfried Horn worked with him and was a supervisor. And it was during that experience that Dr. Horn decided he wanted to excavate at his own site and went across the river to Heshbon. So in the history of American archaeology, this certainly is a very important site.
An important site to come to a conclusion with the book of Joshua.
That's right.
Because it's really calling for faith in God.
It is.
Ultimately, that's the purpose of the book, to have one's faith and confidence in God. However the scholarly debates go, let's come to covenant. So thank you, Kent. Thank you, Larry. And thank all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope it's provided something for you to think about, something to increase your faith, and we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.